just a quick session on communication. So it's basically, what is communication? And I'm just going to talk a little bit about semiotics and interpersonal and group communications. So really, it's just trying to understand how the different ways we communicate, the fact that it's our body language, our tone of voice, our facial expressions, all of these things provide messages to others in our communications. And so it's about being aware of how conflict arises in communications and how we can contribute it, but also mitigate it by having a strong sense of self-awareness and the dynamic. And it's also sometimes about playing with your communication. So let's say, for example, I think most parents know this, child's done something naughty, they shouldn't have eaten biscuits, there's chocolate all over their face, and very sternly, the parent asks, have you been eating cake, the cake or the chocolates? And the child says, no, I haven't. And so you pretend to be angry, whereas inside it's just so obvious that you want to burst out laughing. So we have these sorts of different techniques that we're constantly using in order to get what we want and to, manipulate and coerce others into what we want sometimes if we're being very strategic, or when we're acknowledging that, potentially we haven't always acted in a way that's always the best for communicating with others, and we might have been unfair, let's say. So communication is about sharing meaning. So when we look at this, we communicate to survive, to get along. It's to address our needs. It's to make sense of the world in terms of our abstract ideas and trying to get others to understand what we're talking about and what we mean, and vice versa. So it facilitates cooperation. It's also about maintaining our relationships and sharing information. However, it can also be, in addition to supporting others in terms of our emotional capacity to empathize and sympathize, it can also be used in other ways in terms of exerting or gaining power over others, which we talked about in the last slides or the last video. And these sorts of communications occur at all different levels. So there's the group, the organizational or individual, but also as a society. And the media has a strong role to play in this in terms of how it mediates between different parties in our understanding of the world and news and that sort of thing. So just in terms of a really, really simple notion, it's all quite old literature, and I'm sure it's moved on. However, for our purposes and our subject, it provides enough of a base to understand what's going on, is to look at this notion of semiotics. Now, semiotics are about understanding the signs or the whole construction of communication, and what are these elements. So you have the actual sign or message of what's being communicated. You have the codes, which are a set of signs. So if you ever see red, yellow, green, that's a code because it's stop, slow, go. And we use this all over the world. It's a code that we understand. And then there's conventions or rules for using the signs. You wouldn't make green mean stop or red mean go, because that's counterintuitive toward these sets of codes and signs. So that's the convention. Everybody does it that way. Then you actually have the symbols. So words themselves symbolize other things, whether, the word table symbolizes a hard structure that we can put things on. Or we have actions that also symbolize other things. This might symbolize anger in terms of crossing your arms and having a particular look on your face. And then you have the semantics, and that is the meanings that are caused by certain symbols in the way that they're positioned, either in how we speak or how we do things. So if you think of humor and the notion of sarcasm, it's only funny because of the way that things are expressed in a particular type of pattern. So we also have the channels of how information is communicated. So it might be sound, it might be expression. So you find that, let's say, sound or expression forms dual functions. Not only can they represent or symbolize a meaning, but they're also the medium through which meaning or is translated and communicated. And then you also have noise. And so noise refers to both external noise, context. It could be something like actual physical noise, like traffic, but also internal noise, our internal dialogues, the things that are constantly going on in our head. And all of these things interfere with how we communicate. Now, I've just put up a simple model here, and you'll be able to look at it more closely if you look at the slides. But what it is, it's not the greatest model, but you have the message in the channel, and it says we encode. That was strange. We encode a message to the sender at the far end encodes a message and sends it. The receiver decodes it, and then they themselves will encode it and send back. Now, this is often a very simultaneous process. It's not so linear. It's more of what we'd call a gestalt. It's in the experience of it. But it gives an idea, and there's a constant feedback. Within this, you have the physical environment that you're in, the social environment, as well as the cultural environment. All of these sorts of things come into play. So if you think about your physical environments in terms of where you want to communicate well with people and where you don't. And if you think of territory, if you think of how tables and chairs are set up, or you think of elevations, all of these things come in and present certain messages. That's why courtrooms are designed a certain way and classrooms are designed a different type of way. And language has a lot to play with this, or has a lot to do with it. We have to be very careful with our language. Now, if you just stop here and you see two pictures, they're very, very similar. And I'll just let you think about where were these pictures taken? What do they represent? What's happening? What's similar? What's different? Now, this is from the Associated Press. I'll have to turn here because I can't read that far from the other slide. And it says, a young man walks through chest-deep flood water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. Right, so this is about the New Orleans flood. This is also Associated Press, but think of how the language changes significantly. 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. This says a lot, and it highlights how we manipulate responses and meanings. So you can see from the photos, did the journalist actually speak to these people? What does this journalist know about their lives? How can they make these assumptions? And you start to see how different framings of issues start to come into play. And so we do this all the time in our communications. This is a particularly dangerous type of situation in terms of what it means in mass media and the populations it's reflecting to, and what that means for community safety and how we view things. But it highlights all of these sorts of things that we're talking about in communication and emotionally in the last video, what we respond to, but standing back and taking a different position and saying, hey, what else is happening here? What is the real context? And what are the facts in relation to what's being advocated? So here I just have a couple of things. You can look at the slides on the PowerPoint if you prefer, but it's about communicating and trying to identify what is the sign and message in this picture. What are the codes? What are the conventions that we understand in terms of communication? What are the symbols and the meanings behind this? So ultimately, we're looking at the semantics, but the overall semiotics. How do we read this image, and what is it trying to tell us? Just to let you know, this is from something called, it's a website called Culture Jammers, and what they do is they provide critique of a lot of mainstream sort of products, the world products, media, and the ways that we interact as people. This is an image. It might be hard to see, but you can see that there's a whole bunch of people fighting. It's sort of medieval time. They're going to organize a raid. You see a castle up there, and then you have the caption. Look, if this fails, we'll still have to do business with them, so try to be subtle about it. Right? So once again, it's trying to get across, like, how do we communicate? We really want something, but how do we maintain relations? Here's another image. So it's just about letting yourself wonder, what are these things saying and telling us? and yet another, which is quite common as well. What are the body language? What's the postures? What are the different elements within that image that provides information? So when you're looking at, the group sort of situation in terms of how people communicate, there's been for a long time, I guess, a shorthand for how this happens. And so what they talk about are processes in groups is that we form groups, right? So we come together, and during that we're orienting ourselves, trying to figure out who belongs, what do other people think. It's sort of like going to the boxing ring and gauging your opponent. And then through that, you start to find out where you agree, but you also start to find out where you disagree. And you might have issues of rebellion and conflict as people are negotiating these dynamics. At one point, if a group starts, I guess, to become cohesive, whether it's in a negative way or positive way, but there is some sort of cohesion that keeps people together, you have a norming of that group. And that is, it starts to establish what everyone will accept are the normal, I guess, ground rules or dynamics or ways of being within that group. And that's what starts to be managed. Within that, certain people may leave the group or might be pushed out of the group, that sort of thing. Then in terms of identifying tasks and achieving goals and doing these sorts of things, there is a certain level of production and cooperation that starts to occur as people are working together and identifying tasks, responsibilities, those sorts of things. And at one point, there can be conflict within this. There might be new forming and norming processes, and it might keep going through these cycles. One point the group might end, and then you have a leaving or grieving type situation as people go their different ways, or as individual members leave, that sort of thing. The problem with groups, and this is something to also be considered within notions of communication and how we function, is that we can get groupthink. So if you have particularly charismatic people, or you have really, really strong personalities or powerful people, they can persuade the group to think a certain way. If you only have groups where everyone's quite similar, have shared values, shared beliefs, and there's not very much diversity, you can start to form your own little world where how you view things and how you operate is so normalized that there's no, I guess, entertaining that things can be different. You can have de-individualization or de-individuation, and that is where your individual views, preferences, desires gets assumed by the collective. And we talked about collective versus more individualistic type societies in an earlier video. And you have social loafers, people who just go along for the ride and don't actually invest. And with groups, you also have different types of leadership. And how does this arise? You can have autocratic. One person takes control and makes demands. You can have a laissez-faire type of approach where maybe no one's a leader and it just sort of happens. You can have a democratic, a process by which people agree to how a leader will be elected or who that leader is and what that leader does and how they function. And you have very collective approach as well, where it's very distributed in terms of decision making, and you try not to have a leader. So these are all different things that you're constantly negotiating, and you have examples all around you. Sports teams, at work, even in social work groups at uni. Then you have the intercultural aspects. So you have the individualism and collectivism that we talked about, but you also have more high context type of societies and low context. So Australia, Canada, New Zealand. No, I won't say New Zealand. That's actually both. Australia, Canada, US, England, let's say, are very high context. We really respond a lot using verbal. It's our reliance. If you go to indigenous populations, which is why New Zealand's a bit different because they're quite influenced by Maori culture. If you go to different Asian or African cultures, it's less verbal. There's a lot more nuance into what's not said, into the context and the body language and all these sorts of things. So you can see why there's sometimes huge conflicts that arise between a very direct approach to communication that, let's say, Australians have versus a non-direct approach that other societies might have. So we might go into a business meeting, want to get down to brass tacks, in another society, you might have to have a tea ceremony. You might have to ask a lot of, personal negotiation. How's your family? How is, something important to you, and you have that social, and then you're allowed to gently go into any sort of business negotiation. So you can see that there's different approaches. There's also a power distance, willingness to accept authority and hierarchy. So in which case, if you look at other countries or other organizations, it might be incredibly hierarchical, where you would never dare go above your boss to address an issue. Because there'll be severe consequences for breaking out of that. So if you think of the military, that has very, very strict hierarchical type structures. Whereas a power difference, a different type of power difference might be how we deal with the classroom, where it's much more of a negotiated experience between us. And you also have achievement-oriented versus nurturance-oriented type of approaches. So let's say in Australia, we're very achievement-oriented, goals-oriented. Other cultures are not so much. It's much more about a nurturing and a holistic elements of society, and in terms of a greater focus on well-being. Then you also have our degree of comfortability with uncertainty. And so in which case you want to avoid ambiguity. In our culture, we don't deal well with uncertainty. We want to be very, very clear. If we're ambiguous, it's often a tactic or a strategy in communications. In other cultures, ambiguity is okay, because you're constantly negotiating the silences in the context and other things that are happening. So you can see where it can be quite confusing when you're in cross-cultural communications, how we can accidentally offend other people or be offended ourselves. One of the good issue is when you have, let's say, young people from different cultural backgrounds, and let's say they come into contact with the police, and the police expect eye contact, straight shoulders, and that type of response to show that they're not shifty, whereas they're speaking to kids from a group. Because the police are authority, they cannot look at them directly, and they're required to show a more demure posture. You can see how that leads to huge issues with regards to interpretation of respect of young people showing police appropriate deference. And so you also have issues of ethnocentrism, of assumption of what is right, what is good, what's practical, and what's more successful. And within that, the stereotyping. So when we're enacting communication, we actually have to achieve and have a communication purpose. What are you trying to do? And we do this a lot. If we've upset someone and we want to apologize, how do we do it? How do we better engage with this person, persuade them, consider their position, consider their interests, that sort of thing, which we talked about in the last video. But we might also have games. People can be strategizing. So how are we trying to exert power to get what we want, to manipulate them, or to do things in such a way that we gain the greater benefit? And we'd be putting up the staging, and I talked about theatrics before, putting on a show to get